I think the best way to understand it is simply start with the creation of Zionism, which is not a Jewish or did not come from people who were purportedly Jews, but rather came from British Freemasons. It was Lord Shaftesbury and his son-in-law Palmerston, the same Palmerston that had blown up the Chinese and starved the Irish. They were also the first Zionists. Palmerston is the first person who actually, he said basically it's time for the Jews to return to the homeland, which was news to the Jews. They didn't have a clue about this. And in fact, a number of Jewish historians have puzzled over this, is why would purportedly Anglican British politicians decide that now is the time for the recreation of the state of Israel? But they did, and they developed what was known as the Quatuor Coronati, which was a Masonic lodge, a research lodge. And from this, well, actually before it, there were expeditions that were organized basically by the Freemasons funding different groups, often including members of the British royal family, that went to Judea and did archaeologic digs. And they were basically looking for the historical evidence for the state of Israel, for the ancient state of Israel. So one of the chief archaeologists, Charles Warren, then returned to London and set up the Quatuor Coronati, the research lodge, which was basically, had one of its primary focuses was researching whether or not there was evidence of ancient Israel. But all of the time, they were promoting Zionism. They were promoting the return of the Jews to Judea. And then this group then produced the famous person who was given to history as the beginning of Zionism, Herzel. But if you look at Herzel's background, you can see that he was obviously set in motion by the Quatuor Coronati and this group. He actually had the name in college, which was 20 years before he began his career as a Zionist. He had the name Tancred, which is a character from a novel by Disraeli, who was in the Quatuor Coronati sphere. And Tancred was an individual who had helped return, basically, he defeat the infidels and restore the Holy Land. And so you can see that, Herzel was obviously in league with the proto-Zionists from the very beginning. And then if you look at his funding and stuff, you can see it's coming from the same groups. And then this group incidentally then goes on, and you can trace directly, the Balfour Declaration right out of these individuals. So you have, the British Freemasons working with politicians in the British Isles and elite Jewish banking families, and then you end up with the Balfour Declaration. Okay, it's just a very straight historical trajectory. I haven't filled in all the dots, but anyone interested, I'll be happy to help them, with all of that information. But what really gets interesting is that the same group also produces Nazism. Now, this is a little more tangential, a little harder to see, but it's actually not that difficult to follow. What happens is with Nazism, it comes from the Thule Society. The Thule Society brings the swastika. Actually, I'm not sure if it had the swastika, but it certainly has the Nazi Party, and it has occultism. It's like a racially influenced occult group. And it actually owned the Nazi Party. It actually had created the National Socialist Party. This was a guy, Sabbatendorf, who had basically gotten his motivation from Helen Blavatsky, bizarre individual who created Theosophy. Now, Theosophy was the other strand that leads to Nazism. It was involved with these nationalist movements that come from Manzini. He was one of the originators of them, and Blavatsky is working with these so-called nationalist groups and socialist group. National Socialism was a Blavatsky idea, but she was an occultist. Always this concept of the occult is visible as you go backwards from, the Nazi Party. And Blavatsky is the one who actually kind of transitioned the swastika. The swastika had been a Freemason representation of something. If you look at Rudyard Kipling's books, he uses the swastika very often. And in a few instances, you can see he has it on animals that look like they are being either punished or in a position of they have to pay homage to whoever is the leader of some group. And so Blavatsky, she uses the swastika. She brings the idea of Aryan occultism and then National Socialism. So this is kind of well known. People are, they know that the Thule Society had been the originator of the Nazi Party. They know, people can see that Blavatsky basically was, had kind of brought the Thule Society into existence, that she brought all these elements. But it's when you go back another step, then you can see that Blavatsky was basically set in motion by the same people that created Zionism, because there was a member of Quatuor Coronati who there are documents showing that this was how Blavatsky was placed into motion. Blavatsky basically, she with the Theosophy is just creating a kind of an occult version of Freemasonry. And there is a document that's still in existence which shows where she gets her authority from, and it was from John Yearger, and he had been a member of this, Quatuor Coronati Lodge. Now, what's interesting is that Yearger is also the guy who basically created Aleister Crowley. Yearger had taken sort of the normal Freemason occultism, whatever that is. I mean, it's a secret society. No one really knows exactly how far down, it goes into occultism. But he had created an addition to it, which he called the ancient and primitive rite, which supposedly is the rites of Memphis and Mizraim. I don't mean to use a lot of weird words, but just to give you a flavor of all this. But it comes right from Quatuor Coronati Lodge 2076. Yearger had been a member of it during this time. And then he wanted Crowley to then basically develop a specific organization that would handle sort of the presentation of these ideas to the public. And that is what we know of as OTO, which of course then all branches off into the Golden Dawn, which then circles around and becomes one of the foundations of the fascism, occultism. But when Yearger died, his Crowley's newspaper, Oriflame, had a huge homage obituary to him. And the documents that were created by Yearger to set Crowley in motion are in existence. So this is why a number of people have wondered about this. And it's only when you, I think, look at it in the most paranoid light that it makes the most sense, which is that, a group is basically maneuvering toward the creation of Israel, toward World War II. These things are not catastrophes to be avoided, but rather, are in the broad geopolitical, historical sense, are to be, encouraged. This is why when you look at someone like Winston Churchill, he's what I would call a lifetime actor. I just think he doesn't represent what he really is, his real motivations to the public. We only get to see just a fraction of it. The ones that he wants us to see, or the groups that are controlling him want us to see. The Churchill family, they are among the oldest Masonic families in Britain. In fact, maybe in terms of particularly as the Masons entered into British aristocracy, are perhaps the oldest. You have documents going all the way back to the 18th century with Lord Henry John Spencer, who is one of the Churchill's ancestors, and showing him as a high-ranking Mason. So this is, these strands need more detailing, but they are the real foundation of our understanding of World War II, in my opinion. This is how these movements and these political forces have been put into motion. They all go back to British Freemasonry and the relationship it has with elite Jewish banking families. Again, going back to Churchill, Churchill was basically at a half dozen times in his life was given huge amounts of money by Jewish bankers. Castle and Rothschild, there was another individual whose name escaped me, and those were huge sums. These were millions of dollars. And now historians have said, well, this was a different age. And in fact, this was perhaps an attempt to buy political sway with an influential British political family. Well, I can't find any documentation of any other individual who ever had this. And in fact, Jewish bankers are not really known as, like just giving money away for nothing. So it's a mystery that I think is, best explained by the fact that this relationship between the elite Jewish families and British Freemasonry is not something that we really understand. And I'm often, people wonder if I am anti-Semitic. I would point out that I am not talking about some kind of general conspiracy by Jewish people, if the relationships I'm suggesting exist. In fact, just the opposite. I don't think that in general, Jewish people would have any more of a clue about what's going on at this level than anyone else would. What you have are societies that are in secret, that are kept separate from the ordinary people. And what I would suggest is this, that the Masons are basically at the highest level are crypto Jews. And so when you see the British royal family and Skull and Bones, which is, a manifestation of Freemasonry, different name for it, that one explanation would be that these are people who have some identification back in time to Judaism, but who represent themselves for political effectiveness as Gentiles. If you look at, you're talking about like the Nazi Party, how it's being funded. If you look at Brown Harriman,
right?
It's a law firm. You have, Dulles and Harriman, Bush families in there. And then look at the relationship between Brown, Harriman, and Skull and Bones. Now, it's basically, they're just one and the same. This law firm is completely staffed originally by Skull and Bones member, but it works in conjunction with the Warburg family to help fund the Nazis, right? Well, how can this be? I mean, if these are supposedly elite Brahmin type Gentiles, why would they be, working with Warburg? So you see, when I look at World War II, what I see is it's the Holocaust of the Gentile. I think you got well over 100 million killed.
In terms of soldiers?
And civilians.
Right.
The Homolodor, which is part of all of this, had at least, over 10 million people were starved in the Ukraine. And so you can't even, rounding numbers are 10 million people when you get into the 20th century destruction of Europeans. And so what's really in back of all this? Well, you need to really be able to identify these people to the extent we can with DNA, but you can approach things analytically. On one hand, you have Churchill, who had the idea of total war. Now, total war is basically just the announcing that all moral restrictions are off the table, and that the one entity will attempt to exterminate another. Total war is the destruction of civilians. This is why Churchill advocated the firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg. These are not military requirements. This is just the extermination of a people. Churchill said he hated Germans, wanted to destroy the German people. This is what he said. Now, oddly enough, at this exact moment in history, the Germans are led by someone who has the exact same opinion, basically, in the sense that Hitler said that if the German people fail in the war, they deserve to perish. This was his explanation as to why he wouldn't surrender and why basically he permitted the civilian firebombing and the Red Horde to overrun and destroy the population, even though there was no military chance of success, right? So think about this just as an investigator into history. It's a little unusual that such bizarre moral positions as the requirement for a race to extinguish itself if it loses to be, juxtaposed at the exact time to a leader that wants to advocate total war. So to me, this is fake, and that this is just the holding of the entities in place of the opposite sides for the purpose of population reduction. And I think the same thing is true in World War I. In World War I, basically all of the generals on the Allied side were Masons. And even though this can't be documented as well, this is the claim on the other side, you see. Eustace Mullins, who's a pretty good researcher, in my opinion. I know a lot of people think not ill of him, but I have found him to be pretty accurate and his citations being correct when I've tried to, verify them. Mullins claims that a British nurse was captured toward the end of World War I, and that she uncovered the fact that the Allies were giving food to the Germans, and she recognized that this was being done just to prolong the war. She wrote about this in a nursing journal. She was then captured by the Germans the next week and executed, the only nurse to have that fate administered during World War I. So that would be an example of what we're dealing with, is that once the governments of different countries are controlled surreptitiously by a single group, then genocide is trivial, you see. Mm-hmm. You can just maneuver them into war and then hold as long as the obedience in the ranks is maintained, you can just hold them in place until the populations are evaporated. And so this is the concern I have, Greg, is that when you look at World War I and World War II and the Civil War and the American Revolutionary War and the French Revolution, and, you go on and on, what you see are these really illogical aspects of history, just over and over again, a negative serendipity that just occurs constantly with the result of destruction, of genocide, which is why I think, tracing the swastika backwards to people like Ruskin and Kipling and the British royal family who are Masonic, and then seeing that this is the same group that produces Zionism, I think that kind of gives a sort of a revolution of consciousness. You know what I mean? It gives you got to really start to think a little differently. These things can be, well understood. It's not hard for a researcher to go back and actually trace the exact sequence that I've laid out. This is all just internet research, a couple hours, maybe a few days of work. Everyone can get this done. And then the question is, well, what's the purpose? What is the plan? Well, let's start out with getting an understanding of who has taken control of the political and financial world. What are these individuals, right? What are they? What is the relationship? What is the relationship between Skull and Bones and the British Zionists and the elite Jewish banking families? I mean, what exactly is agreed to and understood, and what organizing principles are in motion? What brought about this catastrophe? One thing that, really got me thinking a few years ago, and this is like something that I'm just astounded there isn't more questioning of, is it led me into questioning the Holocaust narrative, mm-hmm. which I know is a very, very touchy area. People don't like this, any kind of revisionism here. And I'm not at the point of research where I really can do much, but I will say that I don't buy the current story because of one really terrible fact. And that is, at the end of World War II, you had the Nuremberg trial, and the U.S. government basically created a kind of psychological apparatus to come up with both recommendations during the trial and also to present kind of a description of the German people to the world media. And this was run by a guy named Ewen Cameron. Ewen Cameron. He was one they selected, and Cameron came up with the idea that the Germans, he was like Churchill. He hated them. He said they were insane as a people and they needed to have a kind of very, very close control over them, and they should never be permitted to be a free people, basically. Now, Cameron then, was the one who actually brought the so-called German atrocities to he and C.D. Jackson, but I won't go into C.D., but anyway, just so he was instrumental in bringing these information about. Now, later, MK Ultra came into the public awareness through, a number of ways it became known. But one thing turned out, a whole bunch of the pay requisitions were found by John Marks, and then he wrote his book about the Manchurian Candidate. Well, anyway, in the pay requisitions, you could see that Ewen Cameron had been an MK Ultra physician. He had been doing experiments for MK Ultra. And then the avalanche occurred. Then you started to have all of these atrocity stories where it turned out that Cameron was engaged in all of this human experimentation. In other words, he would take individuals who were just depressed, who came to him as a psychiatrist. He would put them into chemical comas. He'd keep them there for a month, and during that time, he'd give them electroshock. I mean, this is all Wikipedia stuff, right? Ewen Cameron. So it just occurred to me that, well, wait a second. The guy who brings the claim of the Germans using human experimentation, right, is actually someone who did human experimentations on a very criminal level. And see, analytically, this just doesn't make any sense, right? It just is not a coincidence that could ever occur accidentally. So you can see that there's something there that needs clarification, right? So this is an amazing fact that is not, for some reason, ever scrutinized, but it's just, again, it's just at the Wikipedia level. Cameron was both the one who was really most identified with human atrocities and experimentation, and he is the one who gave the world this understanding about the Germans doing these things. So if Cameron breaks down, if this whole understanding of history that Cameron provides concerning the Holocaust breaks down, then you have to go, well, where does it end, you see? So if you look at the Holocaust from the perspective of, psychological power in terms of, obviously intimidation or just of a, worldview, right? It's very powerful, very potent. So it needs, high level of understanding and clarity. And yet there it is, just sitting right in front of everybody is, can you really trust anything Ewen Cameron says?